Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Digital Leader Show. This week, we're discussing should corporations take a stand on social issues, plus headlines from digital leaders from the world of enterprise technology. Each week, we discuss key issues and news at the intersection of business, technology, and the humanities in hopes of making you a better digital leader. We're live each Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and the audio recording is available on major podcast platforms. I'm Dan Goodstein. I head up IRPA AI. It's the Institute for Robotic Process Automation and Artificial Intelligence, as well as the Digital Enterprise Institute. We're a professional association, media, peer-to-peer research network, providing education, networking, and advice to over 130,000 members worldwide, all around automation, enterprise AI, and digital transformation. You can check us out at irpaai.com and deinetwork.com for resources, advice, and networking opportunities. My co-host, as always, is Carlos Alvarenga. He's a researcher, the author of The Rules of Persuasion, educator at the University of Maryland in Georgetown, and former EY and Accenture advisor. Carlos, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Dan. Good to be back.
Good to be back. How's your week been?
It's been good. Interesting week as always, right? We're off to the races with our presidential campaign. It looks like I think there was a couple of stops this week. I like politics and follow it pretty closely. So it's we're off to the races.
Mm-hmm. Off to the races, and interesting week for business, just being post Memorial Day now. Happy official summer to you.
That's right. Same to you, Dan.
And a couple of things caught my eye. It's not new, but it looks like this movement to warn the world about AI technology is heating up. There was another kind of warning that came across from the group. The name of the group, Center for AI Safety, who's spearheaded this petition essentially from all these major AI leaders, and they had some new names on the list and some new updates yesterday, basically calling this an existential threat to humanity, right? So for all the people that were saying, hey, this isn't the Terminator thing, it's starting to sound like the Terminator thing.
And again, it continues to be from the people who are making these things for the most part, right? So I suppose on the one hand, you say, look, who would know better than they if what they're creating is problem? But then again, I find it just kind of fascinating that the people who continuously make these things are the ones saying, please stop. We can't stop ourselves, right? We can't regulate ourselves. We don't know what we're, or maybe better yet, we don't really know what we're making. What seems to be the undercurrent through a lot of these is that we're creating something, but we're not really in control of it, and we're not going to stop. So please stop us or control us or corral us or figure out something, because we can't do it ourselves. But in the meantime, we'll continue to make these systems that we don't really understand.
Yeah, well, and you're right. I mean, some of them are active CEOs. The notorious one that just testified before Congress is the OpenAI CEO, which we talked about, who, like you say, is still there, right? But there's also been some others who have actually left the companies they work for because they wanted more freedom. The new one on their list was this guy Jeffrey Hinton, who's in some circles referred to as the godfather of AI. He was at Google and actually just left Google so he could kind of speak more freely about this issue.
And again, like you said, it comes from different people. You're getting it from academics, people who make AI, people who used to make AI, right? There are policy people as well. The problem becomes, because you don't really know what it is that is the problem, right? There's some unspecified risk. So part of the problem is, I think that, okay, great, we'll do something. What do you want us to do? Right? Is it to pause development? It's just to license these systems, right? I read somewhere where someone had said you have to have a, in medical ethics, you have these things called IRBs, right? So internal review boards, or ethical review boards. And so before you launch something into humanity, right, you have to go through protocols and testing and all kinds of things, and then you're allowed permission to do that. In a sense, what could be done is some sort of AI ethical review board, right? And before you launch the next system, it has to go through a protocol of testing it, seeing what its effects are, especially because it's like a drug. We don't know what the side effects are, right? We've already seen that with ChatGPT, that it creates things that weren't part of the original plan. So at the very least, maybe what the industry can do is put together some sort of review panel that would say, listen, you need to bring us what you're making, in privacy, right, under the right conditions. Let us look at what it is, and it's presented in stages until we understand what this system is going to do.
So that's interesting. So how do you? So two things come to mind. One is how do you stop other companies who may be competitive from just using that as the excuse to stop competitors? But the other is the bigger issue always of innovation versus regulation, right?
But we have it in healthcare, right? There's competition for in pharma, so they manage to have these systems in place, right, and these protocols in place, and doesn't stop people from innovating new drugs and new medicines. So I'm sure there's a way of doing this so that it doesn't harm innovation. At the same time, it's providing some sort of social or societal control of the development of technologies that have implications that go far beyond what they're supposed to be. At the end of the day, right? I think it was our guest we had a couple weeks ago said this is a general purpose technology. So that's a good thing and a bad thing, right? In the sense that it's a bad thing because it doesn't really, it's not applied to something, right? It's not an app to make you to get your hotel room to find parking spot, right? It does all kinds of things, and we don't. By saying general means we don't really know, right? We don't have what it's supposed to be doing. So that's a little bit different than what we've had in the past.
Yeah, yeah. And in case you don't think it's booming and you haven't been on LinkedIn or whatever, Nvidia yesterday hit a new record, becoming the first chip maker to see its market cap go up to $1 trillion, although it dipped back below.
It's below right.
Yeah, so it joins the likes of Apple and Microsoft and Alphabet, and it's really thanks to kind of booming demand for its GPUs from AI data centers.
Well, somebody was joking that it did so well because it has A and I. It has actually two I's, right, and one A in the name. So
Oh, so people just searched for it and bought it.
people just search for I and A and just said buy the stock, right? So there you go. You're right. This is a kind of a crazy moment in Wall Street, right? Because I think it went up 25% overnight on kind of this very optimistic earnings report. But yeah, it's the street seems to be thinking, hey, this is the next internet, right? So let's go ahead and get in on it early while we can. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say I'm a more sophisticated investor than that, but maybe not as much as you. But I believe that I believe that people do that because they just don't know and they see the news.
Well, listen, there's no way to explain that the stock closes at 300, opens the next day at 396, right? That's not a rational reevaluation, right?
Right.
It's traditional financial methods just what do they call, right? Irrational exuberance.
Yeah. Yeah.
The thing that caught my mind is, or I mentioned this weekend, was this report that came out from Institute for Public Policy Research in the UK, and it was noted in MIT Download, but I went ahead and pulled the report, and it's a report about workplace surveillance. And while I know that this exists, I hadn't understood kind of the details of it. So I read through the whole report. It makes a fascinating reading, and the extent to which the companies that make this stuff, right, have really proliferated during COVID is still, I think, a little bit underneath the radar. That the ways in which you can be monitored at work. I'm looking at a chart that was in the report. There are 15 different things, right? One of the most interesting one was a company that had a kind of like a wall of employees, and the camera on the computers was taking a picture of the employees, I think every 3 minutes, instead of posting it on the wall. The idea is that you could touch the screen and video conference somebody, but the effect was that it was just a giant surveillance board of every single person, right, kind of in the company, right, and checking your keystrokes, software events, how long you take to do a task, all these different things. And these are not, quote unquote, blue collar jobs, these are white collar jobs. And so it struck me that, and the report says that we're not turning this back. So it's only increasing as the time goes by. And I kept thinking about, if this is what it is today, imagine in 10 years, if that just will be a part and parcel of work, to know that every keystroke, every click, every click of the mouse, everything that you're doing at work there's some system which is capturing all of that and recording it. So I just find it fascinating that the workplace is becoming a a surveillance state. Sort of the conclusion of the report.
So for all those people on those TikToks I've seen of rigging up things to make their mouse move so it looks like they're appearing online on Microsoft Teams, they're in trouble. But no, what I think what's scary about that, at least to me, is the camera part, right? I mean, so
Yeah,
much has been talked about, and we've talked about it. We had the former head of privacy from Amazon Alexa, talking about, hey, is this thing listening to me?
right.
But what's even more scary to me is somebody watching, right? There was reports a couple of years ago that certain TV manufacturers were using cameras. And so there's a camera staring back at you and you're watching TV. And then you add the cybersecurity concerns of these things are made in China or other places. That part to me is the scary part. It seems like it's gotten pretty typical or people are maybe less sensitive to it, but for the longest time people had like post-it notes on their cameras on
Yeah,
their laptops, or at least their work laptops. That was a thing for a while. But I think I had a little bit of exposure to this early in my career, and I was in the IT business. And we would install the software, these apps, on corporate networks. And it was, and then even consumers started wanting to use similar technology to track their kids and what they were doing. And for both kind of use cases, the selling point initially was blocking certain things, right? If you're in the corporate world, maybe there's certain websites that you've seen as a security risk, or you're trying to eliminate employee waste. So you're blocking whatever, Facebook, or probably back then it was MySpace or something. And for kids, right, certain websites that could be detrimental or what have you. But you're right, it very quickly evolved from just filtering to real monitoring, right? It was, hey, this person tried to access this site, and hey, this person typed this word,
sure.
to the extent where back in the instant messaging days, you would get an entire keystroke a transcript of what somebody was typing, to the extent that I used to advise parents not to install this on their kids' computers, because I said, you don't want to know what they're doing at that level of detail.
But the other thing that caught my attention this week was the story about Twitter now sort of crowdsourcing verification on videos and images that are going to be appearing. I said last week when we closed the show, this is going to be our first AI sort of involved election, presidential election, and it's already starting. So they're already, it's their sort of attempt to say, okay, we know the platform is going to start getting inundated with fake videos and fake images that are going to move people's opinions and news and create news, and they're not real. So how do we verify that? This seems to be that they're thinking of this as, okay, we'll allow people to comment. I don't know exactly how it's going to work, because I suppose you could just hire people to go in and reinforce that the thing is true if you really wanted to, right? It was that much of a concerted effort. But again, I find it really interesting that we're going to start to see this sort of mechanization of influence and sort of persuasion, right? And crowd shifting on these social platforms over the course of the next year. I think there'll be at least one or two moments, I predict, that will be sort of major headline shaking moments, and that will be created by false media,
Yeah.
artificial
Yeah.
media. Basically, we're headed to at this point. Mhm. Yep.
So our main story for today is the other social, the social culture wars, if you will. I mean, regardless of where you are in the political sphere, obviously it's been a top of mind for everyone, even some people that are considered liberal being kind of anti some of these social issues, the wokeness and all of that. But I wanted to talk about how it affects us as digital leaders. And more and more this kind of culture war is seeping into boardrooms. There was a report, I think it was about a week and a half ago, from the Wall Street Journal, that there were, based on publicly available information, 682 shareholder proposals filed for annual meetings through today, actually, all around people wanting corporations to take a public stance on some of these issues.
Well, it's interesting, right? This is a topic that I've written about in the past and research. I'm kind of a student of the history of corporation as an idea, right? The first company was East India Company in 1600, was a partnership, and the idea of that a corporation back then was just a piece of paper, right? It was a contract. And so it sort of remained. The first American company was, I think, is Boston Manufacturing Company, 1813, if I'm not mistaken. And we thought of corporations, or people thought of them as contracts, right? They were business arrangements. It didn't have identity. That changes with the case in 1886, Santa Clara County versus, I think it's Southern Pacific Railway, and it's a case that established the idea that a corporation has personhood. So from that moment on, the U.S. law, a corporation, not just people, could have a had was were afforded protections of the 14th Amendment. So this is the moment at which we now move from corporations to a piece of paper. It doesn't have identity or personhood, right? That case changes it. So now we fast forward 100 years or so later, right? And a natural outcome is that people start to think of companies as having not just personhood but personalities, right? The consultant driven sort of the idea of having a brand, right? A brand identity, what's like 80s or 90s or so, means that okay, the company is likable, a company is unlikable, right? And there was also a shift after the financial crisis in '07. I think rather than persecuting people, where we persecuted companies. And so companies paid huge fines. Nobody went to prison, as far as I know, right, over that crisis, but companies paid a record amount in fines. So once again, we thought of them as, hey, we need to punish the company, not the people. I personally think this is really wrong, but I'm in the minority of this. The trend has been completely against what I think is correct. It's been towards the increasing anthropomorphization of companies, right, and thinking of them as human beings. And so now we get to where we are today, which is if a company is a person and the person has rights and it has ethical responsibilities, then along comes a social issue, pick the one you want, and people think, okay, what do you think, company A or company B, about this issue? And certainly the trend is headed toward that being more the case, right? When I work with executives, I used to say companies used to like to sit on I used to call it the neutrality fence, right? And the neutrality fence, unfortunately, is getting smaller and smaller. And you come off in one of three ways: you jump off, you fall off, or you get pushed off. And I think that for a lot of very very publicly kind of considered companies, the neutrality fence is kind of is shrinking, and it'll soon be a thing of the past.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. I mean, I'm with you in the sense that, when I went to it's definitely evolved. When I went to business school, it was you didn't take a side like that. You stayed neutral because you didn't want to alienate 50% of your addressable market, right? You didn't take a side in
Jordan, right? Republicans buy sneakers too. The quote.
exactly. So you didn't take you weren't partisan. You didn't get involved in politics. Social issues weren't as big back then, but you didn't really take a stance on these things. And it's certainly evolved. I think it's evolved to a point where you're in this proverbial no man's land if you don't take a stance. It's almost like here's the line, and you gotta pick a side. Otherwise, it becomes a negative. I think and you actually cover a lot of this in your book, The Rules of Persuasion, that we've been talking about. So if there's another example you might have, but to me, I think the first time I saw this was in the now famous Apple ad where they showed diversity of age and of ethnicity and all these things in that commercial. And I think either on purpose or inadvertently, that was one of the first times I saw a brand be associated with a concept like that, where they were trying to purposely show maybe more diversity than maybe was in advertising for other products. And so I think whether we realized it or not, that became part of Apple's brand identity, back then. I think that was the beginning of it. Now, I think it's become almost a differentiator where in a world where things are becoming more and more commoditized. And we've also talked on this show about, brand loyalty being at an all-time low, that becomes the thing that people become loyal to, and actually maybe differentiates the company versus an organization that doesn't have the same ideals as the consumer, or doesn't have any.
Well, look, you can look at certain uh, events kind of in the history of this phenomenon, right? You had the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which I put in this. If I were drawing a timeline, that to me would get a big bullet point on timeline, because there was this sort of sense of, hey, you have this ethical responsibility. You failed not just as a company, but sort of morally in what happened here. And I think that was one of those sort of moments that sort of really catapulted the idea of this company is responsible, almost like in a ethical way, right? Not just as a business way, but for what's happened. You have in the 90s Disney, right? So people may not recall, there was a big thing in the 90s with Southern Baptist Convention decided to take on Disney, because Disney, I think, is when they first granted uh, marital sort of benefits, right, to same-sex partners. And so
Hmm.
Disney's in their highlights now, but it actually goes back to the 90s, was the first sort of run-in. It was as the SPC against Disney. It's sort of waned out kind of on its own over time, right? So Disney has formed in this space. And I think because it's such an iconic company, what we've seen is the sense of, I think, as the partisanship in the country, sorry, has increased, people look around them and say, okay, I want everything around me, to the degree that it's humanly possible, to align with what I like, and to not be what I don't like, right? So you've got, right, a conservative pillow, right? You've got a liberal car, you've got a liberal phone, you've got a conservative gun, right? So uh, yeah, there's this sense of, look, I want the artifacts and the things that I spend money on to all align with my point of view. And if they don't, then and I'm having to notice it, I'm going to push until I know where you stand on these things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you connected to this again, this kind of wokeism thing. And I've been actually, I actually was watching an interview with Piers Morgan yesterday about about this, and how his opinion was that everybody is trying to create something that is, make everything kind of personal, in whether it's a discussion or debate. And so maybe that's true in the corporate world as well. If again, not taking sides on that argument, but to say, if that is how society is changing, then do companies have to ultimately change with them? But it becomes, to me, there's two categories, right? There's like human rights categories, which are almost easy ones, where to say, okay, we're gonna do certain things because we think it's a basic human right. And then there's some of these very controversial issues, which I guess, who decides what's a human right? That becomes the bigger debate. But there's a really long list of proposals that have been brought to these companies. I mean, there's people, shareholders of Google and American Express, who've asked them to take a stance on abortion. I
Mhm.
mean, that's a pretty divided, hot button issue. Mastercard was at one point considering tracking gun related transactions,
Yeah.
which, by the way, is one of the things that DeSantis in Florida is warning about with crypto, and with this wokeism stuff of, at what point do these companies, if they take a stance, is the next step going to be actually policy based on those opinions or identities. 28% of Bank of America shareholders voted in favor of a proposal that asked the bank to disclose plans to meet a 2030 climate target. Right. So these are very, very hot button issues. So it's not as simple as maybe some of the earlier on things where they say, yeah, obviously we're against war and we're against whatever, child labor, and some of these more universal issues.
Right. And again, going back to the history, right, you go back to the apartheid era, and there were sanctions that companies would face if they violated certain rules, and that continues today with the Ukraine war, for example. There was an interesting story in the Journal today about, or sorry, the New York Times, about insurance companies that are unwittingly ensuring vessels that are violating, right, the sanctions on Russian oil, and how the companies that have these ships kind of get around this monitoring they're having in place. But I think that the issue here is just that, again, right, there's a movement towards asking CEOs, asking companies to be very clear about where they stand on an issue, and it's something that most companies really don't want. Mhm. And then I think we lost your audio.
Oh, sorry, I'm talking to myself. I did the mute button thing. No, I was saying I wonder if companies all don't want to do it though, right? I mean, maybe the big
No,
companies don't, right? But some of the smaller startups, Nish, you have a lot of startups in the ESG space and the sustainability space. I actually wonder the opposite. I wonder how many of them really care about the sustainability issue as much as they're using it as a way of differentiating and getting market share and getting exposure. Maybe that's the cynic in me, but you could make the argument, at least for the challenger company, right, who's trying to gain market share and doesn't have to worry about losing it. It becomes an advantage.
but I think you said there are companies that are happy to sort of take this stand, right? If you think about a company like Chick-fil-A and its sort of alignment, we know that the founder is a devout Christian, and so they don't open on Sunday, and they've been very public about the culture of the company, sort of mirroring, right, um, the beliefs of the founder. And so you've got other companies who take different stands on different things, and so you have this subset of companies that are very public about what they believe in, and including sort of political stances. You've got the ones who try really hard not to take a stand, and then the ones that are sort of in the middle, right? And they suddenly get pushed into having to say something about a social issue, and there is the real issue, right? Because if you're not prepared, to mention a minute ago, right, and you say the wrong thing, that becomes a problem. In fact, I talked to the chief communication officer of a big tech company one time, and he said the problem you have also is this: if you suddenly are forced to say something and you claim to believe X, right, and you have no history, then that's almost just as bad because people think that you're inauthentic or they think it's fake. And he said, for us, the problem is that we don't say something sometimes, and we can take a lot of heat for that because we know that the minute we take a side, people will say, well, you're just saying this for whatever reason, right? Because we haven't commented the facts. So if you have no history, then it becomes incredibly risky to take a position in a position because people will think, well, it's okay, you're being opportunistic in where you land. There are some companies, right, who thrive in this world, like Nike, for example, right? Nike's always been political from the very beginning and is okay sort of being in the middle of all this. Um, but uh, but I think for the average executive, they really prefer to kind of stay out of this. But unfortunately, it goes more and more into the company, right? I used to always say, especially think about a function like procurement, which used to be pretty much kind of an invisible function, and then along came all the issues with, right, forced labor and climate change, and suddenly to be a chief procurement officer, your office has a big window. What do you buy? What do you source? What do you get it from? How do you know it wasn't made by kids and everything else that goes along with these kinds of conversations? How do you know you didn't buy it from, right, the blood diamonds thing that we had a few years ago? So yeah, it's they're all of or most of these, right, senior executive kind of roles now have a political component to them, and a social component. The bigger the company, the more so the case. And again, you don't know when you're going to be brought into this conversation. It can come at any time from anywhere.
Well, I think was interesting about there's also an article this week in Fortune about this, but the back to the journal, the Wall Street Journal article mentioned something interesting. They said that, they were quoting some critics of this, and they said, that these social resolutions that are being pushed on the board, by the way, they're saying that the majority of them are actually voted down. The vast majority of them are actually voted down, but that it's taking away valuable time that boards and directors should be using to focus on a company's bottom line. I thought that was a very interesting statement because, there's I guess there's two parts of the debate. One is should a corporation do this regardless of profit because it's the right thing to do? That gets into the individual versus what is a business, what is a corporation that you mentioned before. But the other is, what I just mentioned is, what if it could help or hurt, the bottom line of the company. I think, there's a great example of, what's happened with Bud Light over the last, couple months with this transgender issue. And it started as, I think not that they were trying to be so great to that community, but I think that they saw it as a marketing, campaign, right? That they, if you read this article, this was also in the Journal. Basically what the piece says is that they did it. The head of marketing did it because the demographic that drinks Bud Light is, or was a very conservative segment. And so they wanted to get, more market share in the liberal segment. So they actually did this purposely to get into that segment without maybe thinking through or expecting the backlash of, okay, now we're going to lose this other segment. And then when they pulled back from it, they may have lost both segments in the process.
Well, Mars had the thing with M&Ms, right? A few weeks ago, the same thing. They changed the color. Suddenly it becomes a thing on Fox, right? And what was candy become some kind of social signifier of bigger things, right? And I think what happens is you have this quote unquote sort of pundit class on both sides that's constantly scanning for things that they can use to make a point, right, in their favor. And a company doesn't know it's going to be using this way, but suddenly it is. And there you are, right on the headlines about, well, why are you supporting this division or that division? And to me, that's the really interesting part. For me personally, it comes down to, well, why is the company, right, being put in the middle of this? If the companies don't run themselves, right, they're not robust, at least not yet. And so every company has a team of people making decisions. So why don't you ask the CEO what she feels about this issue, or the CFO, or wherever you like, right, and see where they stand. But to ask the company is the part that I think is kind of odd, right? Because the company supposedly represents all of its people. So is that really the company? Is Budweiser, right, a problem, or whoever created this campaign a problem? If you don't like the campaign, that's where I find it kind of odd, and I don't like the idea of treating companies as people. I think people are people, and executives are people, and they make decisions. They should be rewarded when they do well. They should be punished when they do something terrible. Go to jail when they break the law, right? And it's I just don't understand this fascination with creating the feeling that a company, quote unquote, is left or right, woke or not woke, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I think the issue is, I think you have to almost declare one way or another, right? I see both sides of it. I see I see, and this is not a push for wokeism or not wokeism, but I think that, there's certain established brands that should probably remain neutral. And I think it should be okay for them to, because like you say, they're established, they're not people, they don't have personalities, they should apply to everybody. It shouldn't matter if you're, black, white, brown, yellow, whatever. If everybody likes beer, or if you like beer, right? It shouldn't matter, right? But then there's the hypocrisy piece. There's the brands that were launched on these philosophies, right? And so I think that's where I think it's more fair to say, wait a second, I think back to like stories like what was the thing that my wife loved watching, the Duggars or whatever, with all the kids and all of those reality shows or whatever, and then the guy was like, ended up being a child molester or whatever, right? It wasn't for me, I never had an issue with their way of life. People were very critical of it before, like, oh, this is weird, whatever. I have no issue with that way of life or whatever they did, until it became, oh, wait a second, you were judgy and you were prejudiced against all these other groups, and then you were a hypocrite because you did these horrible things that were horrible for anybody, but especially horrible for someone who's preaching to the world. So I think that's it. Is if you're a brand that's preaching that was built and stands on a particular thing, whether it's sustainability or diversity or whatever it is, then you do have a high benchmark that you have to keep at that point.
But again, right, it's still the executives who are responsible for the company that is the hypocritical company. Again, a company to me can't be hypocritical. Its leadership can be hypocritical, right? But ultimately, it's a person in charge. I think it was yesterday Elizabeth Holmes surrendered for right to go to prison in
Yeah.
Texas. Okay, that Theranos didn't go to prison; she went to prison. Theranos didn't deceive anybody; she did. And so, I think if you have a question about how an executive feels, and you feel, hey, you're CEO of a public company, you're in the public eye. I'd like to know how you feel about abortion, gun control, whatever. That's great. But to ask Ford how it feels about abortion seems ridiculous.
Well, unless you're going to, hire certain people, give prevalence to certain people. That I think that's where the lines start to blur, right? Corporations aren't people, but they do have policies, right? And so if a board adopts a particular policy
Yeah,
that is
right.
reflective of a social issue, then they have to live up to that litmus test, I
And
think.
you're right. And again, show me who the board is, right? If you don't like the policy, that's a great example, right? Wonderful. The people on the board
Mm.
are who? What if they adopted a policy which you hate, then fight to be and you care, you're a shareholder, fight right to get someone else on the board. But again, I'm in the minority of this. I think the trend is definitely headed the other way, and companies, interesting enough, abet it, right? You've got a company that has a Twitter feed and seems and tries to come across as a person. You just need to be careful, because if it does something wrong, then it just ends up backfiring on you. But I think this is part of a broader trend, Dan, because there is this movement to give sort of personhood, right, to other things as well. Right? We do it with machines now more and more, and it'll be increasingly the case, right, going forward because of AI. Animals as well, right? The animal rights movement has been a methodical, kind of under the radar legal battle over the last 5 decades to grant personhood to animals, and I think this is a slow but successful campaign. And so, machines, animals, companies, we seem as a society to want to feel like, okay, I feel better if I like the airline I fly in, right? Or I like the company that makes the cars. And we talk about Elon Musk all the time and about Tesla. It's another good example, right? What was a darling, quote unquote, right, of the liberal, sort of rich liberal customer base, which sort of supported Tesla in its early years, because of the very clear shift that the new owner and CEO has made. Right now, you've got liberals saying, "Well, I'm leaving the platform, right? Or I'm not buying a Tesla because I don't want to support Tesla anymore because I understand now what the CEO sort of feels." I just find it's a slippery slope if we're going to have to judge everything we buy through a political lens. And at what point do you have to say, okay, you're going to have to put on your product, where do you stand? Like I can imagine, right? Again, it's not too far to think that there's going to be some sort of labeling, right? And you say, okay, here, I'm going to put all these labels on my product, so you know where I stand on these 12 issues before you buy, a box of crayons.
But you know what, so if I come full circle with it though, Carlos, the other area where I would say, to kind of agree with you and disagree with you at the same time, right? If corporations are really just made up of people, then they attract the type of people that they want to, right? I mean, you've seen HR campaigns where, under their reasons for, this is a good place to work, some of those social issues have been added to that list. And then I would say, where it does affect me individually is maybe I don't care where they are on abortion, but I might care about how happy their employees are to work there based on those policies. I may want to be, the company. Maybe I don't pick the company because they have a really good maternity or daycare for their employees, but if their employees are happier because of that policy and treat me better in a customer experience situation, then all of a sudden you start connecting the dots.
And this has been a debate for a while, right? When I was a consultant, I worked for companies whose philosophy was, hey, we have no creature comforts here. All right. Everybody flies coach. I don't care if you're going to Shanghai from California. We don't really care. There was one company I can think of famously, the executives were told to grab all the soaps in the hotel, right? They would bring it home and put it in a basket at headquarters, right? And there was this very extremely frugal culture. Now, their view was, hey, we pay you a lot of money, right? And similar with I knew people who worked on Wall Street investment bank, right? And the bank's view was, hey, we don't pay for taxis, we don't pay for food, we don't order any dinner on us, buy your own dinner, right? You're an investment banker, you're a stockbroker, you can afford dinner. You don't need us paying you for dinner because the money's going to go into the bonuses, and that's it. And that was the culture. And people who worked there liked that culture, right? They got ticked off if somebody was trying to expense the dinner. Other places were dealing with you around, right? Hey, the more the merrier, buy whatever you want, right? We don't really care. And so that's a cultural thing. And I think if you're thinking about working someplace where you look at the culture of the company, is one model right and one model wrong? No, or these are just business models and how they operate. And one certainly fits a certain type of person, and one another one. The issue becomes then, to me, the problem is also the sense of, okay, companies are big companies have hundreds of thousands of people, right? I think Amazon has over 1 million. So when we say, does Amazon believe in this? You're talking about 1 million and plus employees. How on earth, right, could a company claim to speak for over 1 million people? So if it's not all of them, then which ones? Let's just take that company. Say, okay, Amazon puts out a board statement tomorrow. Are we saying that the Amazon board says we're pro-abortion? Okay, so who's pro-abortion exactly in this case? Huh? Is it Amazon, the entity? Is it the 1.4 million people who work there? Is it the board? Like, what are they saying by saying yes to this statement? I don't even know you can even define what that is, right? Who exactly are you speaking for in a company that has 500,000 employees when the board takes the resolution against or for something?
And I don't see how that position would really affect the operations of the company. I will tell you where, an example of a business where it does affect the operations of the company is an experience company like Disney, right? So Disney, is in this war with Florida Mayor Ron DeSantis, which really started about education and gay rights in schools. And this is a brand that I think they care about certain policy, because right or wrong, because it plays into their brand identity and therefore the experience of their guests. And again, right or wrong, but what really gets me, and I'm fascinated by this ongoing saga between Florida and Disney, the hypocrisy that goes on. So and maybe to your point of, from a different perspective now from a politician's perspective, why take the bait and get into a political debate with a corporation when you're the pro-business capitalism party, right? I mean this thing is, now they're talking about an office project that was supposed to be in Orlando that
Yeah,
was going to be $1 billion. So a lot of tax revenue and 2,000 high paying jobs. Now Disney's pulling it from Florida because of this whole thing.
you're right. And again, it isn't as if Disney was the poster child of wokeness, right? It's a big company for the most part. Big corporations are pretty conservative by nature, right? They exist just to make money. The problem is that Disney and companies like it, and from its very beginning, right? It's created culture. So if you're in Philadelphia, you haven't seen it, go to the Franklin. They have a wonderful exhibit called 100 Years of Disney that I saw not too long ago. And from the very beginning, right, you get this sense of the the way in which it's influenced how people think. And I think Disney got into crosshairs, right? Because of it, like the same reason they got in the 90s, which was they shape culture. And the feeling is, hey, this is a company that it's shaping culture in a way that I don't like, right? So but for the most part, right, what Disney does as a concern has nothing to do with this. And you're right, it is. I think what upsets people on the right about this, some people on the right, is that we're supposed to be the party, right, of laissez-faire capitalism, the company that supports business. Here we have the biggest employer in the state, a company that has a history of doing right, bringing nothing but economic benefit to Florida, and this is the company you picked, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, I
what,
mean, you could argue, like you say, you could argue it was the opposite, right?
yeah,
Even former descendants of Walt Disney have accused Disney of being, too capitalistic and not consumer focused enough. Yeah, I mean, there's hypocrisy on both sides. To be fair, I don't. I also don't know why Disney took a stance on this issue, because I don't see how, the what's being taught. And I happen to disagree with what Florida did, but I don't see what it has to do with guest experience at Disney parks. What I do is actually the previous debate that people seem to have forgotten about, which is the mask debate, right? I mean, the Florida government was at odds with Disney during, at the end of the pandemic, because they were more strict on masks than the state was. And to me, that's an issue that, Disney should take a stand on, because they believe they actually turned down profits, that you could argue, because they thought, guest safety was so important. But what's being taught in schools, I don't see how that helps either side of the debate
well,
for corporation.
also, right, is this, and it's been talked about and written about, this sort of millennial effect of that generation pushing, right, pressuring internally companies that were used to sit on kind of the neutrality fence to get off the fence. And so, if that's the case, there might be a population now sufficiently important within a company like Disney that begins to pressure the executive team little by little, right, to take a stand on these kinds of issues, even they probably don't want to do it. But now that constituency, which is everybody who works here, uh, wants it. And if that is the case, right, that now we're going to start segmenting, like you're coming out of MBA school and you make the list of companies that align with your values or social views. That's where you're going to apply, and you're not going to apply the ones that don't. That'll be an interesting phenomenon, right? Because that hasn't been the case in the past. At least having taught MBAs, we, when it was recruiting week, right? It wasn't okay. Left blue companies on this side of Van Munching Hall, right? Or blue company, red companies on the other side. But is that where we're going to? Okay, the Hall A is for all the liberal companies that are here to recruit, and across the hall is the conservative group that's coming to recruit, right? And pick which side of the hall you want to go to. So maybe that's what it is. Again, most people don't see it the way I do, and maybe that's what it is, right, Danny? That it is that generation of the new generation that's entering middle management now, in some cases even beyond that, that's saying, look, I take pride in having a social view, and I want the company that I work for to have the same thing, which means that that's the case, it's only going to get more so. And
Yeah, I think, the other part of it is, and I'm thinking about maybe a less controversial issue as an example, right? So I was asked to speak to a group a couple weeks ago about accelerating, getting more women into the tech world and into STEM industries. There's an issue that most people agree on. That was a particular situation where, I think the reason why they came to me and, other industry groups, is because they see it as an opportunity to advance that agenda in a way that maybe their local governments have not done, right? And so, if you go the government route and you don't get very far, you say, what are the other, institutions that I can leverage to accelerate this agenda? And, the corporate world, certainly the American corporate world, is probably the next biggest, right? Maybe even bigger.
you're right, and corporations have tremendous influence on social issues, right? They wield economic and political power. We know that. No, there's no country on earth that has lobbying system the way we have here in DC, right, where I live. And so, yeah, it's natural. I still think though that the right strategy is to say, I want to talk to the CEO, I want to talk to the board, I want to talk to the suite and see what they have to say, rather than saying I'm going to go attack Disney. All right. Well, let's talk. If you have an issue, why not sit down with Mr. Iger, right, who runs the company, and talk through what this issue is, instead of saying, "Oh, I'm going to go attack Disney." Most people who work at Disney had nothing to do with the thing that upset you. If it was the board or the CEO, then fine, take it out with them. But why would you end up impacting those 2,000 people who had, and some of them had moved already to Florida, right? Now,
Yeah.
who ended up paying the price, right? You score some political points, but okay, the people who were actually affected in a way that's material, were the folks that had moved to Florida, had sold their homes in California, thought the campus was going to be in Orlando, right? And now Disney's saying, okay, we may have to relocate you back to California, but entire lives were uprooted, right? Schools were changed, kids' lives were changed.
That's right.
Now, because of this really ridiculous fight that could have been handled in a much different way, now they're the ones that end up having to have their lives disrupted over what could have been handled in the old days, right? A politician had an issue with a CEO, with a company. You call a CEO. I'm sure they went into some room and sort of worked it out. I guess in today's world, you fight it out on Twitter.
Fight it out on Twitter, and Elon gets richer.
And
Hey,
gets,
great conversation, my friend. And for all you watching, thanks for joining us. We have a variety of coaching and advice available on a variety of topics. So if there's anything that you're working on that we can help you with, let us know. Otherwise, check out DEInetwork.com and ERPAI.com. In the meantime, we'll be back on Wednesday at noon Eastern. Yes.
See you next week, Dan. Thank you, everybody, for watching. See everybody next Wednesday.
Have a great week, everybody.
Bye-bye.